There we go.
Okay, cool. So the three things we really wanted to cover in this meeting were just reviewing and setting a baseline against some of the existing identity standards work that has been happening in other communities for quite a while, just to give us a baseline of understanding of where Ceramic might be able to add value to the existing ecosystem. And then the second topic was we wanted to share some of the existing thinking and work that's gone into identity on Ceramic to this point. And that includes things like DID methods and IDX and some auxiliary identity related work, like how to define a basic profile or how to construct a social graph, things like that. And how to like link accounts. And then the third piece that we wanted to do was to break up identity into more focused groups. So that way people aren't scared off.
IIW is October 20th.
Okay. But I mean, Schwartz, Graven, how familiar are you guys with some of the existing work related to like DIDs or identity hubs and secure data stores, stuff like that?
Done a decent amount of reading, never actually worked with any of them, so I don't have any hands-on experience. So all academic.
Okay. Yeah, let me pull up some materials then. Just opening it. All right, so here, obviously one of the core components to identity is an identifier. And so most of the thinking around this that's gone into identity by various groups, and one of the first things that these various groups tackled in the beginning was trying to specify how can we create a common way to represent an entity online that's sort of in a platform agnostic way. So basically, like, what's the URI for an identity? Kalia, is there anything, any background or context that you'd want to share for Graven or John about DIDs?
So, sorry, I'm in two meetings at once. The DID meeting is happening now. Let me just check that I'm actually on mute. Okay. That's in terms of like representing, you're talking about, the question is about profiles and how we're representing them?
No, just like some background context on DIDs, like, what's the current state, where they come from.
Sure. So DIDs, that's a good question. So there were several things that came together to create DIDs. One was the work coming out of the educational community and the open badges and block certs. So one of the issues that they had is they were anchoring credentials to URLs of educational institutions. And URLs are beautiful, but they're not persistent. Like, they don't last forever. You have to keep renewing them. And you also, the folks who were going to resolve them were dependent on the educational institution stuff being up. The other thread came from sort of like the cryptography world and looking at, or like crypto world, like the blockchain, Bitcoin, etc. And at an event called Rebooting the Web of Trust, and the second event that they had at ID 2020 in April of 2000 and I want to say 16. I hope my dates are right. That's when the first ever sort of first spec was written. Like the whiteboarding happened. I led that meeting, and they came away with the specification. And really the goal was to figure out how you could have decentralized identifiers with associated public keys be resolvable on different, the vision was that they could be run on different blockchain networks, that it wasn't just one, and that you would have, there would be enough in common that you could get a sort of baseline set of things that all the DID methods would use, and then there would be a flowering of different DID methods that had slightly different uses and needs and stuff. So we're in the Cambrian explosion right now of DID methods. There are a lot of them. And we'll see where they go in the future. There may be more, but basically the core components are the set of public, the DID itself is in a DID, all DIDs come with DID documents. The DID itself, the public keys associated with it, the, when it was created, along with the algorithms that you can use to authenticate against it, and if you want a service endpoint. And then other DID methods can add more things in their DID documents and have done so. So yeah, and there's another type of DID that's sort of emerged, which is peer DIDs, which don't ever appear on Ledger, but they're created by two parties who want to talk to each other. And that specification is called DIDCOM, DID communications, and that's also being developed at the diff. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. And really helpful context about where they came from. John and Graven, any questions, or is this new, just to help us like level set?
No, that's helpful. I've seen the product of some of that stuff, but didn't know the backstory and who and what and where when. So thanks.
Yeah, great.
Cool. Yeah, John, I see your note. So that's the IDs. The other piece to some of the existing work, which until recently was a bit hard for me to even parse apart, was until Kalia aligned me to some of the land, but any day now. So one of the other big pieces to this is how basically like discovery, permissions management, and storage is handled for a DID. And some of the existing approaches to this were one or some combination of identity hubs and encrypted data vaults, which apparently merged into secure data stores. Kalia, any like background context that you want to provide there?
Sure. So encrypted data vaults are a key component to I'm just trying to think of the words. Like supporting people having the ability to store information associated with DIDs and keep the information encrypted in an encrypted data vault. And it's designed really to support the service provider of wherever you're hosting the data, not having any insight into the data because it's entirely encrypted. And you have something called an encrypted data vault client. That's where the keys live to go and access the information in the data vault. And the idea is you could pick up your encrypted data vault and move it anywhere else, and you don't have to do anything to be able to access it with those keys and control it, because the two layers are entirely separate. This is a really important component and was developed in part with funding from the DHS and their work doing building out, sort of using these technologies in supply chain management. specifically so that folks can store stuff in an encrypted data vault that's related to their DIDs and their, whatever's in the, whatever's in the shipping container that isn't relevant to their competitors, et cetera, and that they could still share that information with customs when they cross, because they'd share the keys to access that information. The work and that work was being done under the auspices of the W3C credentials community group, and was going to become like a subgroup there. At the same time, you had the hub work at DIF, which is sort of like encrypted data vaults plus intelligence about what's in the vault, like the metadata, like is it your music collection or your movies or your whatever friendly, like you can make up all sorts of stuff we could imagine, and people already do store in services like Google or Amazon, and sort of genericizing that so that people could store all the data plus the indexes about it and have that useful to developers or whoever they choose to access it and provide them services. So the good thing is that instead of having two working groups almost doing the same thing, we combined, and we have a joint working group called Secure Data Store that's going to work first on the encrypted data vault part, and then also make sure that the hub vision also aligns with that, so you have kind of a complete stack. There's a strong push to make sure that synchronization and replication, at least replication, are automatically part of it. So you by implementing the standard, you're preventing vendor lock-in, because individuals can always have two copies in two different service providers in real time. That way, if you can either keep your own backup somewhere, or you could also just have like Amazon Cloud and Google whatever host it, and you'd be assured that you aren't locked into those vendors. So really there's a strong emphasis on getting a solid specification that empowers people and prevents the ability of vendors to lock people in, and really get people what we want, which is our own data under our control and the power to move it around and not have it all melt down. And this is, I would say, another important actor in this universe is the My Data community. So they have been, they're coming at it from a slightly different angle. They've already identified 48 different companies that they call My Data operators or proto My Data operators that are providing services for people around collecting and helping them manage their data. There's 7 different types of My Data operators they've discovered and identified. And eventually some of those companies will shift over and adopt these specifications, hopefully. But right now they're actually in the wild working. So there's an interesting landscape of activity. But right now there's at least 3 companies that have encrypted data vaults based on the encrypted data vault specification as it was working. And so it's real technology. It's not just like people imagining it. And we're just trying to get that standardized and aligned with the hub vision. And I'm one of the co-chairs of that group, the Secure Data Store group.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Graven.
I just had a question. It might take it off topic a little bit, but one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of identity, is there any work towards pseudonymous, unique identity, like one-to-one matching? Because you could spin up as many DIDs as you want. Is there any work towards like saying one-to-one, this person is this DID? We don't know exactly who it is, but we know it's one person. We know they don't have other identities out there, just like in terms of like for, I don't know, limiting the ability of people to just spin up bots or whatever these could be used for.
Right. So there's a bunch of protocols, there's a bunch of different things working on like global human uniqueness. Um,
Even just that
IDEMA
term will give me
is
stuff.
one of them, Bright ID. I mean that, so just to be clear, not clear, but like that isn't a core problem that, like it's a problem that's within the context, I guess, of IIW, but it's not a topic our community's really dealt with a lot because we're not trying to solve that problem. In fact, I would go the other way, that our community, you know, it's been around for a while, leans, not that there aren't use cases where you need to solve for that problem, but it's been much more concerned about how people have the freedom to express themselves with different personas without them being linked because of the nature of having only one persona linked to everything you do being really dangerous as like a requirement as opposed to a choice, or like a choice to sort of be globally unique with a particular, within a particular universe of identifiers. Great, go do that, but in the meantime I still want to have my religious persona separate from my work persona, separate from my dating persona, right? Like, and the only way to achieve that separation in the digital world is to literally have different identifiers for those activities.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's helpful. And I get kind of the balance there. So I'll try to find and take a look at some of those other things just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit to that, like, to me, like the idea of like having one algorithm or like one institution or whatever that kind of can assign a binary, like, is this a person or a human or not, is really absurd and kind of, I think could cause a lot of harm. If it's an algorithm, it's very likely that that will be faulty or will be able to be gamed. And if it's an institution, well, there's very likely that that could be corrupt. So like, I think personally, I'm kind of very against having like one unique human identifier system. That seems very dangerous.
So I think there's two problems that are worth noting that are different. One is, are you globally unique? Meaning you can't do a sort of voting Sybil attack where you have a whole, why you try and flood a system. The other is, are you a human? And those aren't different questions, and they're not necessarily, they shouldn't necessarily be conflated, right? So there's folks talking about how you would issue credentials to an to a person that says, hey, I'm a person, not a legal entity or not a thing or not, you know, a bot, right? And that kind of potential credentialing is slightly different than being globally unique in a particular namespace.
So there's another component that's, you know, pretty core to some of the identity standards work called verifiable credentials. And I urge you to take a look at some of that work. I think for the purposes of this meeting, it's not as critical as some of the first two things, because basically it's a way to create signed data that others can interpret. And that's, you know, it's one way to reflect assertions online, basically, and can be used for a lot of things. Obviously, like, you know, digital certificates of all kinds or message attribution. There's also a lot of other ways that can be done. And sort of, if you have signed data and you can resolve it against a DID, you can have some source attribution. But there's very explicit use cases where verifiable credentials have certain fields and properties that make them better for claims of various kinds, like expiries and other things. But again, for the purposes of this meeting, I think we'll focus on the identifier and the data management side of things. because basically you can store credentials anywhere, including in some of these things. Um, so the next piece that we'll cover is, I'll actually skip over the 3ID did method, which is a piece of what we're working on Ceramic, but where I lost my screen here. Okay, cool. And so now I guess let's turn a little bit to where Ceramic can add to this identity conversation. So really when we first created Ceramic, we were looking for a way to do decentralized identity management, which is in effect, it seems like a similar goal as a hub. If you can think of—
Wait. Sorry. I'd really love if you could explain what you mean by identity management, because that term in enterprise world means something really different than what you're saying. So if you can like pull out and be like, what? Yeah.
So very concretely, when we were building 3Box, we recognized a bunch of problems with the way decentralized identity could be implemented in peer-to-peer systems. And so basically all of the work that hubs are trying to do, sort of saying, or secure data stores as a collection of a hub and an encrypted data vault, which is kind of like more or less dumb storage. And then you have the hub provides it with some amount of intelligence and routing. The problem that we realized, and when we were trying to migrate 3Box to a more decentralized architecture, is there's no way to do a decentralized hub. Basically, all the things that a hub does, so manage your permissions and privacy, manage the endpoints to your encrypted data vaults, manage your metadata and indexes, basically like what is the mechanism of discovery of resources, the endpoints, the things that you want to, databases or stores or credentials or all of these things, how do you associate them to an identifier in a peer-to-peer manner? Because with a lot of our customers, there's no way that they're forcing their users to pay some service provider to host a hub. That's just like not in the realm of what we've heard people care about in the decentralized web. So identity management, when I say that, is more a shorthand way of saying a way to provide context and capability to a DID in a decentralized way, whether that's associating data stores to it, associating keys or accounts, profiles, social data like social graphs, and all of these things. Like, how can a user show up to my site, log in or authenticate, and then I need some way to request access to a whole set of information. And in the existing work, that's all been assumed to happen on a centralized server with a hub. But that's a non-starter for all of our people that have been building with 3Box and that have expressed interest in Ceramic. And so the bulk and heavy lifting of the work done to date is really trying to think about how can we create a peer-to-peer version of a hub, more or less, or how can we create a decentralized way of doing resource discovery, routing, and permissions. And I see some more have joined. I wasn't looking at the video, but yeah, welcome. So it's generally like the first scope of where Ceramic can add to the conversation is in being like at the core, Ceramic is a peer-to-peer document management platform. And it's really general, but if you have documents that are owned by DIDs and they can be updated and they can be verified with schemas, and they're discoverable on the Ceramic network, and they're trusted because they're anchored in blockchain, so you can do things like have them store content that demands explicit strict ordering, like you would need if you're managing some kind of keys or you're rotating keys of a DID, and things like that. Like you need the guarantees of blockchain, but you need the flexibility of IPFS-based documents. And yeah, so generally that's the core. And we can spend a bunch of time just like talking about IDX, which is some proposal to do that. And then there's a lot of auxiliary work that could happen. So one of the core use cases we found with Freebox was just basically, okay, how can you do decentralized profiles? And what's the agreed upon schema for various profiles? Like at Freebox, we had one profile with no schema. And now people have been asking, how can we do multiple profiles with any schema for any sort of context? And so there's some work happening at just defining what some initial schemas for profiles might be for various contexts, starting with just a basic profile. And then there's further work that can be done by basically saying, you know, what are some ways that you might represent a social graph, which can be encrypted or not, or how could you represent various connections? So yeah. Well, yeah, I heard one to say.
Oh, sorry. I mean, it's interesting to think about the social graph work. I think one of the assumptions, I don't know if it's an assumption, but the idea that folks have about forming a social graph with DID is a lot of it's based on using DIDCOM and creating peer-to-peer connections that would not necessarily be expressed in the way we do so today, which is sort of like a list of followers in Twitter or Facebook linked to persistent identifiers that are common across all of those channels. Like I don't have multiple Twitter handles and I'm not pairwise connecting to all my friends. I have one centralized identity in Twitter and I use that. And the part of what's being done with the agent work and the DIDCOM is that the paradigm shifts to a decentralized paradigm where I create pairwise identifiers for every relationship that I have with other people and entities, and that each one of them has its own basically channel that I connect to them on, and that the social network itself is decentralized, sort of radically so, in that I don't have persistent identifiers. I don't have a persistent identifier for all those relationships.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead, Joel.
go ahead, Jenna.
Nope.
One thing that I worry about with that type of approach is kind of the centralization vector of having people having to have like these data vaults that store all where you store all of these kind of pairwise identifiers, because they're not stored like publicly on a centralized network. You kind of have to store them like, and you can't do, either you have to like host one yourself, which most people are like going to do, or you kind of host them at some service, and that service, like someone's going to provide the service, and that's likely going to be like a very few set of few actors. So like one of the reasons like that I find like an approach where you have like more stuff in public, but that may be decrypted or in various form like obfuscated, is that you can actually, the data isn't like hosted by one provider, and you can like make sure that there's actual decentralization of the entire system. So that's like some nuance to those two approaches.
In general, I think there's some things to consider about I think a lot of the work has been trying to develop standards around some of these things. But it seems that the more logic you push to the endpoints and the more work you make them do, um, the more centralization you're going to get. And that, like, the more you can do more powerful things, but you're also compromising on other principles. And so I don't know that there needs to be, like, I think one of the things that we've been swirling around internally is like, there are going to be many layers to the system, and there's definitely not going to be one way to do anything. And so how can we make different use cases possible with, depending on the circumstance that a user is in? Like, maybe if I'm trying to manage my medical data or some kind of sensitive PII, like, no way should you store that on a public network. You should most definitely store that in something like an encrypted data vault. But it shouldn't be either or, right? Like, it shouldn't only be you can only use encrypted data vaults, or it shouldn't only be everything needs to be stored.
So just to be clear, like, the encrypted data vaults are not the entity that manages the social relationships and holds keys in the way I described. Those are really agents. So the agent work is ongoing in their areas at Hyperledger. I'm a little bit confused. My understanding is that the agent software can run on your device or in the cloud wherever you want it to, including on your own home server. So I'm a little bit confused about the concern about centralization when, like, I guess, maybe something that could be clarifying is to really get clear about what forms of centralization and decentralization are like most concerning and or where you want to go, because even that word has different meanings. Like, there's a project within, I think it was at CCG, and I think it's moved in some of, anyways, it's a well-known document. I'll look it up, around looking at decentralization rubrics and different lenses that you can look at centralization and decentralization. And then, because there isn't just one way to look at it, right? So in order to get out of this conversational dilemma, they're like, let's write it all out and get clear about the different perspectives. So I'll find that document. I think it could be really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so
I can just clarify like what I meant with that. And so basically, like, yeah, sure, you can run this agents on your device or on some cloud or whatever on your home computer, which not many people actually have, but you can run them pretty much anywhere. And that makes sense. But the same thing was true for early day internet. You could run your own web page on your home server computer, like on your own device or somewhere else. And I think that's kind of this, you kind of get into the same dilemma of like, yes, you can do that, but it ends up like these, like Google, Facebook, like large companies that have like a lot of computational resources, and they get like a huge advantage. And that's kind of the thing that I would like to avoid.
So I hear you, and I believe, and I think many who are working on really hard on these open standards believe, is the way you fight them is through open standards that force infinite, like, mean that portability is always an option, and the keys and the power are with the individual, not with the service provider. And that's how people are trying to address that problem, is through, the development of these open standards to fight that power. So anyways.
Yeah. And I mean, there's it's two different sides. Like, if you know, if a user is like, I'm going to run this myself, then they need something that's always online, which becomes harder, and or they're paying someone or multiple people for redundancy, which is expensive, and just generally, even with the ability to move something around or like eject an agent provider, we're basically saying that shouldn't be the only option, because with the implied assumption that these things are almost like directly mapped from the DID, you have no choice. And in the context of a decentralized application that wants to publish some of this information in a decentralized peer-to-peer way and rely on the open web and a network of node providers and infrastructure providers, they would be excluded from all of this work. And so that is kind of really the starting point of where a lot of IDX comes from, is can we provide the same, like a framework where almost the entirety of hub functionality could be replicated on a peer-to-peer context, but you can also extend this framework with hubs and agents and secure data stores. So basically we're saying there needs to be another, like DIDs are decentralized and that they're registered on a public network where they're always resolvable. There should be another decentralized layer before you get to these components that provides optionality in the architecture of a decentralized identity. And so does that context and just general thinking around where we are, where we came from, how this fits into existing work generally?
Hi, Michael. Apologies that I didn't make the top of the meeting. But so the part I heard sounds like I understand where you're coming from. I think perhaps the source of many of, not that I need to speak for Clea, because Clea can definitely speak for herself. I think the source of her questions is understanding what are we going to do that other organizations, other collectives aren't already attending to. I'm not quite clear what we bring, what we add to the universe of people focused on identity at the moment. For my part, a lot of the language around Ceramic and IDX seems to be, again, no disrespect to anyone who's compiled this, but it does seem to be echoing generally accepted ideas around identity in a digital world. Lots of ideas that were developed by a rather homogenous bunch of individuals very close to the software world as opposed to the real world. Now, I don't want to derail anything that the Ceramic team wants to get set on, as it were, but I think perhaps part of the reason I was invited here was to just offer up a different lens. And I guess, therefore, if that's going to be useful, it's going to be useful up front as opposed to, just as we're about to launch Alpha. So, and I'm prepared to talk about this at greater length, but I'll just put it into the conversation right now. What if everyone's got this wrong? What if identity actually isn't akin to authenticating to a computer system? What happens if it was something a little bit more than authenticating to a computer system, which is the mindset that most software engineers and software architectures approach that? What if there was no such thing outside of law as personal data? What happens if that doesn't actually exist in the world? It's just a legal conceptualization. Are we designing to support a legal conceptualization, or do we want to develop code for how the world actually works? All of the ideas that we have here about personal data, it's not personal data, it's interpersonal data. It describes relationships between two or more parties. Sometimes that party is a legal person if it's a company, but often it's just other humans. Even my DNA is not personal. It's something I share with some of my nearest and dearest, right? So what happens if identity is a social construct and therefore it's edge-centric instead of node-centric? Where do vaults come in? Vaults are node-centric. The entire architecture seems to be predicated on sand, not rock. It just feels like we're trying to tell the world, this is how you need to approach identity in a digitally pervasive world. And this is where you need to put your data because we think it's decentralized. But I don't think that's reflective of how identity works. We talk about the social graph as if it's separate, as if it's a node joined to another node. But psychologists, ecologists, sociologists, complexity scientists, students of cultural studies, they all know that information, relationships, and identity are all interlinked, reciprocally defining, co-constitutive. They're not separate things that we can consider architecturally like they're a separation of concerns. It's about the most fundamental place where the idea of separation of concerns is entirely inappropriate. And yet that's all I'm seeing here. So I guess fundamentally, I feel like this is starting off if we were looking for a delta out there, the delta would be to do something that is how the world works rather than how the general data protection regulation is framed. It should be GDPR compliant, but we shouldn't be led by its false conceptualization of the world. So to me, that would be an opportunity to contribute to the discussion, but just to pick up the false conceptualizations from prior work and assemble it into a new framework. It doesn't, I don't see how that adds to everything that's going on at the moment. So again, with apologies for missing a good 25 minutes, which I can't get back. It was unavoidable. That's what I'm sensing at the moment. I don't see it.
So maybe, I mean, your framing made me think that like you're approaching this from like a different perspective. That's like, I think we're getting at the same thing, but the perspective is like skewed. So the way I see kind of IDX and like what it is, I think of it more as like, if you think about like a mathematical identity. So a mathematical identity is basically like a function that kind of returns itself. And in that sense, like that's what this is. It's like a very like computer science-y approach to like, okay, how do we get like, how can I have this piece of data that I can refer to multiple times and like get back the same thing basically. But the thing that I get back multiple times is kind of the reference to the data that I'm generating as I'm interacting with like the world. So the way I kind of see identity in like the broader scope and kind of the scope that you're, I think, coming from it at is like, so when I'm like interacting with other people, with applications, using like some type of computerized system, I like as soon as I do something, I'm generating data, and that data is like it's being stored first like locally, then it might be sent up to some server, and then I might send some data to you, and we might make some connection and relationship. And I think that's really what identity is. It's like the aggregation and the insight that we can draw from that data that we generate when we interact with each other and the world. And I think that's really kind of the end goal here. But I think like what identity index is more kind of just that identity function in a more mathematical sense. Does that kind of...
However, it does, but I viscerally feel that is more Newtonian than the actual complex, messy world that we live in. And if we try to rock up with a Newtonian idea of these discrete, lovely little packets of data that I can store quite nicely in a little vault somewhere, and I can link to with a DID. And if somebody wants to ask if I got a degree from a certain university, I can offer up a verifiable credential to prove that I did. And isn't that lovely? That takes absolutely no account for how identity works in the world. It makes no account of the emergent consequences, the dystopian emergent consequences of just that capability. We can all see now, with the benefit of hindsight, how social media has been as useful as we thought it might be, but how utterly detrimental it's been to society and democracy. We didn't see that 12 years ago, but now we can. What I'm saying is we're about to set up the same for identity. If we carry on with this monodisciplinary mathematical / computer science approach to identity, we are going to have effects in the world that are counter to the ones we think we're contributing. There is nobody on this call, there's nobody on any other identity call that I've ever been on that has had any other discipline except for computer science and maybe a couple of lawyers around the edge, because we know that we need to be legally compliant, and that's it. And that group of people is fundamentally contributing a pervasive identity defining, not just identifying like an agentic technology. This has an impact on the human condition. And we're just tossing it around like it's a spanner and a bolt and a nut and a little bit of screwdriver that we've got to just screw in a little bit further just to make it compatible. This is bonkers. I genuinely feel that if ceramic is going to do something important in the world, first of all, we need to invite some more disciplines to the party. That itself would give it an edge on all of the other groups working on digital identity, because they are largely monodisciplinary.
So, Philip, can I ask you a question?
Oh, of course, Danny, yeah.
So I think a lot of first of all, a lot of it is fair. And I think we've talked about this a bunch, so I'm not surprised where you're coming from and glad you're bringing this perspective. As Joel said, I do think that there's a lot that has informed the goals of ceramic that come from a lot of the same ideas that you have in terms of identity as a much more generative, much more social construct. At the end of the day, and IDX is just a draft right now, so the language and also how it works can change. At the end of the day, as Joel said, how data is generated online that then feeds into relationships and identities in a very fluid way. It does have to land somewhere. It has to hit a structure, and that structure shouldn't be monolithic. It shouldn't be rigid. It shouldn't be independent. It should be more social and more fluid. But there does have to be a computer science structure into which that data lands so that it can be made use of. And so I think the goal is, what's the structure that is flexible and creates that set of relationships that doesn't have the dystopian outcome and instead has a better one. And so that's what the goal of IDX is. And I'm curious what it is. It might, like, I don't know if it's the language that frames ceramic or the people on the call or aspects of what you see in IDX, but I'm just curious about, like, what is it that's triggering your thought that this is leading to a monolithic approach?
So if we look at the work on living systems, Maturana's work, Fritjof's work, then we realize that autopoiesis, this idea of self-making, this idea of generative living, beautiful living systems, then you know that there is, so autopoiesis involves the pattern that ossifies as structure, and when you combine it with process, that distinguishes living systems from dead systems, right? So pattern, structure, and process. This is incredibly well known by ecologists and complexity scientists and those who do work with living systems. We've got, you just used the word structured, Danny, and probably not with that paradigm in mind, but it's interesting that you do, because here we are, we're just about to commit code, and code is structure, but without understanding the patterns that we're working with. until we have an equal understanding of the patterns, the structure, and the process that contribute into a generative living system that is respectful of human dignity, then we're playing with fire. We are going through the same loop that previous architects of identity systems have been through, many of which led to prosecution, exclusion, and death. So this is not something to just play around with lightly, in my humble opinion. So I love what you just said there, Danny, but that means that we have to step back and understand the patterns that other disciplines have identified in relationship to identity before just coming at it with a computer scientist approach of there's data and it needs to reside somewhere and we need to refer to it.
I have a question, Philip. Thank you for providing this. This is like so insightful. And I think that mindset really, just for a lot of not even just identity. I mean, if you go to some of the blockchain conferences around the world talking about changing finance and the way it works, you get a lot of Westerners who have money who aren't working in the places that really need change. So that's not really the point I'm making. I'm just making an analogy. My question is, and I'm really new to all this, so I'm just trying to learn, well, I guess it's two-part. One is, what are the immediate next steps that need to happen? So like we hop off this call and we know we need more diversity. We know we need to be thinking humans before technology. Where do you start with that? And the second question to that is, there is a large amount of funding and money and just like technical progression that's happening at a very fast rate. And so what technical decisions can you make now to preserve optionality in the future and not corner ourselves into something that's really dangerous?
Bloody hell, they're all good questions. I am cognizant of coming across like an arsehole, just to be clear.
I love it.
I'm not saying you were calling me an arsehole. I'm just saying it's a difficult thing to do, to rock up on a call at someone else's invitation, thank you, and then try and run the risk of perceiving like you're putting a spanner in the wheel. It didn't go down for me well last year when I attempted to do that with some identity groups, but I genuinely believe that we're on the cusp of doing something very wrong in the world. And that's a hard thing to say, especially when someone then asks that question, great question, and then I can't go, oh, well, I know the answer to that. We've got to do is 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, and 6. Because of course I don't have the answers. So I'm doing a PhD in web science at the moment, which is a discipline that Sir Tim Berners-Lee co-founded in 2008. And he and his cohort defined it specifically for the challenge you just described. They recognized that the web and associated network technologies are necessarily transdisciplinary. And so they started web science to bring the disciplines together. And up to a point, they failed, right?